In the 16 years since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia has experienced what can only be described as an economic and cultural metamorphosis. Socialism has given way to privatization, and that has led to vast wealth for some. Many in Russia argue that democracy and liberty are suffering at the altar of commerce. Others fear the man in charge, Vladimir Putin, seems more like a Soviet-era party boss than the leader of a free country. What does all this mean for Russia's relationship with the West? Has the fall of the Iron Curtain led to a political realignment? We'll look at these and other issues next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
Many in the West thought the Soviet Union's demise was democracy's great triumph. It seemed to be the beginning of a new era for freedom in Russia and beyond. But just as very few predicted the fall of the USSR 16 years ago, few would have predicted the kind of country Russia has become today. Many Russians are embracing capitalism. The emerging middle class flocks to countless chain stores that have appeared in Russian cities. New American and European cars zip through the streets, replacing Soviet-era junkers. There's a construction boom. The economy is growing.
There are a lot of things going on in Russia that give the Russians reason for self-satisfaction and even a certain cockiness.
But the opening of Russia's markets hasn't been free of controversy. Immediately after the Soviet Union's collapse, a select few Russian businessmen, many with ties to the Kremlin, bought up the bulk of the country's formerly state-owned industries. Oil, telecommunications, transportation, all at bargain basement prices. They made billions. Today, many say business deals don't get done without the Kremlin's approval. And some of these oligarchs now find themselves living in exile or even in a Siberian prison for no other reason than being on the wrong side of a dispute with Vladimir Putin. Speaking truth to power is a relatively new phenomenon in Russia. Democratic reform movements do exist, most notably the coalition known as the Other Russia, and one of its leaders, former chess champion Garry Kasparov. The group has drawn attention to a variety of issues: freedom of the press, civil liberties, the war in Chechnya, and even alleged assassinations of political opponents at home and abroad. Here's the question: are such opposition groups in Russia just part of a vigorous democratic process, or is democracy in Russia fundamentally threatened? How far has this nation come from its authoritarian past, and where is it heading? There's also Russia's evolving and volatile relationship with Europe and the United States.
We know that what President Bush thought he saw in President Putin's eyes didn't turn out to be there, and it certainly was never a basis for a relationship.
Russia may not be the evil empire anymore, but East and West still seem to disagree on a lot. Reexamining Russia, next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. To help us explore Russia's role in the world and its relations with the United States, Stephen Sestanovich, Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and former U.S. Ambassador to the once Soviet states. And Dmitry Simes, President of the Nixon Center, which publishes the bi-monthly journal called The National Interest. Welcome to you both. So is Russia still a superpower, Steve?
The short answer is no. We used to say that the Soviet Union had the second largest economy in the world. Today, Russia's economy is about the size of the Netherlands and Belgium. We used to say that the Soviet Union spent more on defense than the United States. Today, it's about a tenth of what the United States spends. It has many attributes of power, though. It has a veto in the UN Security Council. It's got thousands of strategic nuclear weapons. And those make it a force in international relations. But even the concept superpower has a kind of Cold War ring to it.
A little outdated, maybe?
Maybe.
Dmitry, what do you think? Is it still a superpower?
No, it's not a superpower, but it's an important power for reasons which Steve have mentioned. And of course, also huge Russian energy resources. And also Russian growing opposition to the United States, which becomes a magnet for a number of America's adversaries, like Iran, for instance, like Venezuela, like Syria. So Russia is not a crucial global player, but still quite an important power.
We talked with Jessica Matthews, who's president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, about this question of Russia's asserting itself in the world. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Russia feels that in the 1990s it was humiliated by the West, told what to do, looked down on. And the more they talk about it, the more it gets blown up into this sense of humiliation. And now, with oil money, that's the big thing that has changed. There is a feeling that they can finally tell the West where to get off, and that Russia is back. And I think one thing we have to remember is this is a country that lost an empire overnight, and that's pretty hard to swallow. So now this sense of humiliation from the 90s is coming back.
Dmitry, you mentioned the energy issue a moment ago yourself. Do you think that this is a way Russia is reasserting itself as a power in the world?
Well, obviously they were extremely lucky during the last 6-7 years when energy prices went up. Russian energy production actually is not going up, but the prices allowed them to become at first economically self-sufficient, to reduce their deficit, and to make others dependent upon Russian economic largesse. But let me make one point about what Jessica have just said. It's not only that the Russians felt humiliated, the Russians also felt that they were not appreciated, because they don't think that they lost the empire. They think that they voluntarily gave up the empire, and that they were entitled to be treated as a partner and friend of the West. And that did not quite happen. So there is a lot of disappointment in Russia, and not only among people supportive of Putin.
Do you think Russia should be treated as a friend and partner of the West?
Not now. At that time, in my view, absolutely. That was a mistake, and you cannot redress history.
Steve?
Well, the 90s were a hard decade for the Russians, and it wasn't just losing an empire. Many people had their first brush with poverty and with rather desperate economic conditions, and they remember that bitterly. The other powers of Europe and the United States actually made a big effort to treat Russia as a friend and partner, and a lot of the sort of theatrics of diplomacy in that decade were all about elevating Russia's role, according it a kind of respect and deference that many people didn't really think it deserved and that it couldn't quite live up to. Some of the difficulty of that time had to do with the Russian sense that they were being patronized. They didn't always fall in line with American foreign policy. They often objected. And much of the story of that decade is actually about the tensions between Russia and Western states, as there was an attempt to establish what the ground rules of a new world order were going to be. But it was one that the Russians still remember with considerable embarrassment and resentment.
You mentioned first brush with poverty among Russian, first Soviet, then Russian citizens. How would you characterize Russia today? Is it a poor country? There's a lot of money swashing around Russia.
Russia is a poor country. I think the economists say poor middle-income country. It has a per capita income that's less than Poland, say, but it's above Azerbaijan. But it's a country with, first of all, a lot of rich people, a lot of natural wealth, and a lot of people who are feeling middle class for the first time, and particularly in contrast to the way they felt in the 1990s. There's a middle class that Russian sociologists kind of feel is about 20% of the population. People who can afford a car for the first time, who can afford
not a Russian-made car, probably.
Some Russian-made cars, but of course it's more popular to have, if you can afford it, a German car. If you can't, a South Korean car. These are people who are taking their first foreign vacations. They're beginning to feel wealth. If you go to Moscow, Moscow is one of the world's great boom towns. The money that is sloshing around the streets of Moscow is there in torrents.
Dmitry, I remember flying over the old Soviet Union and then Russia in the years immediately after the end of the Cold War and looking down and seeing deteriorating railroad tracks, airports with hundreds of planes that were sort of mothballed because they didn't work, they didn't have parts. And I remember thinking at the time, this is a country that whose infrastructure is essentially collapsed. Where does it stand today? Has it resurrected itself in that regard?
Russia is still, as Steve said, a relatively poor country. And obviously, they could not quite change the economic situation during the last 7 years. But they have turned the corner. And it was not just a question of poverty, as Steve said. It was a question of desperation. It was a question of people totally disoriented, having no idea how they would survive and where their country was going. Wages, pensions were not paid on time. Sometimes they would not be paid for months. Now they feel they have a modicum of security.
Do they know where they're going today?
I think that what they feel is that there is predictability and dignity. And that's why they like Putin. They don't like him because he's a great Democrat or because they agree with him on foreign policy. I don't think they care much about foreign policy. But they do feel that they know that they will be able to pay their bills next month. And Russians, they very rarely think strategically about their lives. If they know that during next 6 months they will be able to manage, they're satisfied.
The Russian army, we don't hear much about the Russian army these days. As Steve mentioned earlier, during the Cold War years, that was often built up as a big threatening force, the military. But Russia does brandish its economic power and its control over energy resources these days. Dmitry, you mentioned that earlier. Should others, including the United States, feel threatened by the way it's using its energy and its economic power in the world?
Well, threatened is a loaded term. But clearly, Russia is more self-confident. Russia is more assertive. And let me be absolutely blunt. They are not shy about using their energy resources for political purposes. Before we become too outraged by that, let's remember that the United States is using American economic leverage, financial leverage, all the time. No other country introduces sanctions as often as the United States, and for so many reasons. The Russians, of course, are not in the same league with the United States, but they want to use their economy for political purposes, and very often their political purposes are quite different from political purposes of the United States.
Great Decisions spoke with John Bruton, who is the European Union's ambassador to the United States, about that very point of using economic power as political leverage. Let's hear what he has to say.
Russia now is obviously very much empowered by the fact that energy prices are so much higher than they were, making Russian energy supplies much more valuable. And Russia is determined to assert itself. And that's entirely natural. But obviously it's important that it should do so in a way, number one, that is respectful of long-term agreements and creates stability for its neighbours. Number two, that is respectful of the sovereignty of other nations, including its immediate neighbours. It doesn't have any special rights over any independent countries that now exist in what was formerly its empire. These are now independent countries, and Russia needs to respect their freedom to go their own way.
Steve, does Russia respect the freedom and independence of the countries that were once part of the former Soviet Union?
Russia's most explosive and emotional foreign policy disagreements are with its small neighbors who used to be part of the Soviet Union. And these have become disturbing to many other countries that watch it. In 2007, you had a major confrontation approaching a kind of national hysteria between Russia and Estonia. In 2006, you had something approaching the same with more racist overtones between Russia and Georgia. Working out the kind of relationship that Russia is going to have with its neighbors is one of the major unresolved issues of its, not just of its foreign policy, but of its identity. And the Russians have a set of feelings about their relations with those countries that are not easily reconciled with what we think of as normal relations between independent states.
Let's talk a little bit about Russia's relationship with the United States, and I think to at least some extent that relationship is defined by an old issue and a somewhat newer issue. And the newer issue I'm thinking of is the Middle East. There was a time, right after the end of the Cold War, when Russia and the United States actually worked together, hand in hand, to bring the Arabs and the Israelis together around a peace table in Madrid. Is that conceivable today? Do you think that could happen again, Dmitry?
No, and it's not necessary because, again, Russia is not a superpower. Russia does not have that kind of presence in the Middle East. The most we need from Russia, and the most we can get from Russia, is, I would say, a supporting role at the UN Security Council. The trouble is that, of course, they don't see Iran, they don't see the Middle East the same way as the United States. Iran was a very good neighbor to Russia. And they would accommodate the United States and Iran only if they felt that they could get something from the United States in other areas. And when we talk to the Russians about the danger of Iran, they talk to us back about how Georgia is challenging Russia and how Georgian military is being armed and trained by the United States. So the big question is, what are fundamental American interests vis-a-vis Russia? If fundamental American interests are to support these small states, Russian new neighbors, in whichever disagreement they have with Russia, then the relationship is likely to deteriorate. If we will focus on key strategic American interests, non-proliferation, counterterrorism, then I think in many areas we can work with Russia.
Steve, you want to comment on the relationship with Iran and the United States?
About Iran, Russia has very conflicted views about Iran. They are attracted to the idea that a good relationship with Iran may check the United States, may at least annoy the United States. They're a little worried about...
And they want to do that? They want to annoy the United States?
I think that's a kind of unspoken goal that...
a lot of them want to annoy the United States.
Yeah. In thinking about how to get over humiliation and to show that they're back, for a lot of Russians, the only real measure of that is, can you defy the United States? Can you put the United States in its place? Can you get something that the United States doesn't want you to have? But they are also disturbed about Iran. They feel that the Iranians have basically deceived them on the issue of their nuclear program. They're a little nervous about the radicalization of Iranian rhetoric, with a kind of ideological fundamentalist cast to it. And they've been saying that actually longer than many American analysts. Their policy, on balance, has been to try to accommodate Iran. You could even call it appeasement. But it's not because they think there are no problems that emanate from Iran. They've just made a decision to try to deal with those by having a constructive relationship.
Some of our viewers may not know that the Russians provided much of Iran's nuclear technology with which they are building their nuclear power plant or whatever they're building in the view of the United States.
And their conflicted view about the nuclear efforts of Iran is shown in the way in which they have tried to drag out the completion of the plant, the nuclear power plant that they have built for Iran. They keep saying, it's just a few months before we'll send you the fuel for the plant. It keeps getting pushed into the future.
Now, there's an elephant in the room, and none of us has mentioned it so far, but the United States is tied down in two wars in the Middle East and Central Asia, Afghanistan and Iraq. Do the Russians want to annoy the United States enough to be rooting for those who are keeping the U.S. kind of bogged down in that region? Dmitry?
No. President Putin is not a friend of the United States, and he obviously is not a Democrat. He is a pragmatic leader, however, and he knows where the red lines are, and he does understand that Iran, it's an important issue for the United States, but it is not yet a defining issue. Iraq is a defining issue. They do not want to be on the wrong side in Iraq. They are not doing, to the best of my knowledge, anything in Iraq that could be considered hostile. They are not supporting America, but they are not with our enemies either. I am talking about Iraq.
A lot of Russian foreign policy analysts, when they look at the world and try to understand the balance of power, begin by saying the United States is weaker because of its setbacks in Iraq, and that's good for us. I think analytically that is probably President Putin's view as well, but it doesn't translate into a policy of trying to make things worse for the United States in Iraq. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the invasion in 2003, Russia seemed more receptive than many other European countries to putting this issue behind us and trying to reestablish a good relationship with the United States. And even today, they're among the first countries to try to be establishing a position in the Iraqi oil sector. They like the idea of expanding their activities there.
You know, there was a time when all three of us in this room would have spent a lot of our time worrying about Russian nuclear weapons, Russian missiles, American missiles, negotiations over nuclear arms. Why is that hardly talked about anymore?
Because the Cold War is over, and
those missiles don't matter anymore?
The missiles mattered in relation to hostility between the two sides, and with that muted, and with nobody really able to see such a level of confrontation emerging in the future, the possibility that there could be nuclear war is excluded by both sides. But the arsenals are still there.
Dmitry, do you think they're going to build them up when the START treaty expires?
Well, they will build them up, but not by very much. And I agree with Steve that the danger of nuclear war is minimal. But the arsenals are relevant. Let's go back to Russian-Georgian confrontation. Georgian forces are better and better armed and trained primarily by the United States. There is a possibility of a conflict between Georgia and two Georgian enclaves which are separatist and now are allied with Russia. If there is a military confrontation there, Russia is likely to assume that the United States would not go very far in supporting Georgia because of Russian nuclear arsenal. So the arsenal is not threatening the United States directly, but it is a political and psychological factor.
Let's bring in another voice. Strobe Talbot is the president of the Brookings Institution in Washington. Great Decision spoke to him as well.
It is virtually certain that President Putin will step down, that he will relinquish the presidency. But it's also virtually certain that his vote, as it were, will count for more than all the rest of the votes cast put together, by which I mean simply he will pick his successor. And that, of course, is not the way that a healthy modern democracy is supposed to work. What I think it probably means looking to the future in the post-Putin era is that the post-Putin era will bear a very strong resemblance to the Putin era, not least because President Putin himself will have so much to do with picking who his successor is.
Dmitry, twice in this program you have referred to Vladimir Putin as not a Democrat. We're in an election season. We don't know how the Russian elections in all likelihood are going to turn out. We certainly don't know what's going to happen with Putin in the end. Give us your thumbnail prediction of whether Russia will turn over its leadership to a new leadership and Putin will disappear from the political string pulling, or will he always be in the background?
Well, back in 1996, when Yeltsin was considered a Democrat, I knew that he would be reelected by hook or by crook, and that's what happened. In Putin's case, perhaps he is not going to be reelected, but he will stay in control.
He can't be reelected.
Of course he can be reelected. They discover tomorrow that there were terrorists attacking Moscow, that they were funded by the Georgians and by American security services. But the point is that short of introducing an emergency rule, which my hope is Putin is not going to do, they have mechanisms to arrange political succession in a way when Putin leaves without leaving. And mind you, he is allowed to run again in 2012, and everybody assumes that he is going to do it. So ironically, whoever will be elected or rather appointed a new president would become a lame duck, everybody waiting for Putin's return.
Steve, final word. your view of the election situation, and particularly Putin's role after the elections?
For Putin, stepping down is in a way to magnify and glorify his achievement as the man who stabilized Russia. If he has to stay as president for life, then he's only created a Central Asian dictatorship. If he can step down because the Constitution calls for it, he's created, he'll say, a modern European country. The reality is somewhere between the two, because he seems most likely, he claims, to step down, but to retain the kind of influence that may not actually be less than many of the presidents for life that we see elsewhere in the world.
Stephen Sestanovich, Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Dimitri Simes, President of the Nixon Center and publisher of the National Interest bi-monthly magazine. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.